I want to start with a phrase that is currently undergoing a bit of a hostile takeover. You have probably used it. You have definitely heard it.
Oh, absolutely. It is everywhere right now.
Right. So the scenario is simple. Someone looks you in the eye and tells a lie that is so obvious, so transparent, it's just insulting. And for decades, the standard descriptor for that was a bald-faced lie. B-A-L-D. Like a face without a beard.
Yes, exactly. But recently, we are seeing a shift.
A huge shift. Smart people, well-read people, they're calling it a bold-faced lie. And the pedants go crazy over this. They just scream error. But, and this is what we are getting into today, if you actually stop and think about the cognitive load of that phrase, the mistake might actually be doing a better job than the original.
It is a fascinating hill to die on because, strictly speaking, the bold-faced crowd has a really solid point. If you are lying to someone's face, you are being audacious, you're being bold. So the error isn't random at all. It's more of a recalibration.
Exactly. And that is exactly what we are unpacking in today's deep dive. We aren't just looking at grammar gaffes or, misheard lyrics. We are looking at a specific linguistic phenomenon where the wrong version of a phrase actually contains a superior or at least a highly competitive internal logic.
Yeah, we dug into the archives and pulled up the etymology for this. We're going to dissect 15 of these phrases to understand not just where they come from, but why the human brain seems so determined to rewrite them.
And to really do that, we need to introduce the actual term for this. It's not just a mistake, it's called an eggcorn.
Right, eggcorn. This term was coined back in 2003 by the linguist Jeff Pullum. It came out of this discussion about a woman who literally referred to an acorn as an eggcorn.
Which is just the perfect example of what we are talking about. It is not a slip of the tongue. It's a recategorization.
Think about the physical object itself. It is shaped exactly like an egg, and it is a seed, just like a kernel of corn. The brain hears this abstract sound, acorn, which really has no other semantic links in modern English, and it swaps it out.
It swaps it for egg and corn, two words that visually describe the object sitting right in front of you.
Yes, it is the brain acting as an optimization machine. It finds a feasible argument for why the words should sound that way.
That is the key takeaway for everyone listening today. The brain hates abstraction. It craves concrete visuals. So when we hear a fossilized word or some archaic term, our cognitive reflex is to override it with something that makes visual sense right now.
Which leads us nicely to our first category of phrases, the ones where the mistake actually makes total sense.
Let's start with a phrase that usually signals the end of a long, boring meeting, for all intents and purposes.
A classic. This is the correct version, rooted deeply in legal history. It actually comes from a 16th century Act of Parliament, which read, "To all intents, constructions, and purposes." It was basically lawyer speak for, "We've covered every possible angle."
But in casual conversation, that final S in intents gets swallowed. And what people hear and what they eventually start saying is, "for all intents and purposes."
And this is where the cognitive science really kicks in. Intents is an abstract concept. It is about potentiality. But intensive, that is a heavy concrete word.
It implies high stakes, high energy, extreme focus.
Exactly. If you say, for all intents and purposes, he is the boss, you are not just saying technically. You are saying his purpose is intense. He is effectively wielding power. The eggcorn adds a layer of urgency that the legal original completely lacks.
It creates that feasible argument you mentioned earlier. You can easily argue that intensive purposes are the only purposes that actually matter in that specific context.
The speaker is subconsciously strengthening the phrase to match the weight of the situation.
We see that same drive for description in food, of all things. Let's talk about coleslaw, or as a shocking number of people prefer to call it, cold slaw.
This one is a great example of foreign word rejection. The original is Dutch, coleslaw. Cool meaning cabbage, and slaw meaning salad. Very simple.
But when English speakers adopted it, the sound cold didn't mean anything to them. Coal is just a sound.
But cold. That is a sensory reality. You take the container out of the fridge, and it is cold. The brain just goes, it is a slaw that is served cold.
And historically, this isn't even a new mistake. The sources point out print references to cold slaw going all the way back to the late 1700s. And there's a twist here that validates it entirely.
Right, the existence of hot slaw, which is a boiled cabbage dish. If hot slaw exists, then distinguishing cold slaw isn't redundant at all. It is necessary classification.
It is the brain acting as a waiter, making sure you get the right order. It corrects the ambiguity of the Dutch loanword.
Precisely. It is a semantic repair.
Let's pivot to one that I think is a genuine Rorschach test for how you view the world. Deep-seated versus deep-seated. Now, the pedants will tell you it is spelled S-E-A-T-E-D.
Yes, because this refers to a seat of power or a center of authority. A deep-seated problem is one where the headquarters of the problem is buried deep. It is structural.
But deep-seated S-E-D-E-D is totally taking over. And I would argue it's because we have moved away from an era where we talk about seats of power and into an era where we use biological metaphors for everything.
That is a really sharp observation. Seated implies agricultural roots. If a problem is deep-seated, it has roots that go way down into the soil. It implies that if you try to pull it out, you are going to have to dig.
And isn't that a way more visceral image for a psychological issue? Deep-seated feels static. It's just sitting there. But deep-seated feels alive, growing, maybe even invasive.
It creates a narrative of growth and entanglement. Both phrases mean difficult to remove, but seated actually explains why it is difficult to remove. You can only really tell the difference in print anyway.
That brings us to the second category in our stack for this deep dive. This is where we see the Eggcorn acting as a kind of killer of history. You called these fossil words.
I did, yes. English is just littered with words that are effectively dead. They do not exist in our daily vocabulary anymore, except for one single idiom that keeps them on life support.
The poster child for this has to be on tenterhooks.
Oh, definitely. This takes us way back to the medieval wool trade. This was a massive part of the economy. After you wove cloth, you had to wash it and then dry it without it shrinking. So they used these massive wooden frames called tenters.
Which comes from the Latin tender, meaning to stretch, the same root as tension.
Exactly. And to hold the wet cloth on the frame, they drove in these sharp, bent nails. Those were the tenterhooks. So being on tenterhooks meant you were stretched to your breaking point. And is a beautiful metaphor for suspense and anxiety.
But here is the problem. We don't weave cloth anymore. You don't have tenters in your backyard. So the word tenter is a linguistic ghost. When a modern speaker hears that phrase, their brain scans its database for tenter, finds 0 results, and autocorrects to the nearest logical match, which is tender.
On tenterhooks. And this changes the metaphor entirely in a really dark way.
It shifts it from mechanical tension to bodily harm. Tender implies flesh. It implies vulnerability. Tenderhooks sounds like hooks designed to rip into tender meat.
Which, ironically enough, captures the feeling of anxiety perfectly. It is visceral. It hurts. So even though it destroys the history of the cloth trade, it preserves and maybe even amplifies the emotional impact of the idiom.
We see the exact same thing with death knell. K-N-E-L.
Another fossil. The knell is the specific slow ringing of a bell for a funeral. But again, how often do we talk about knells in modern English?
Basically never. So the brain hears knell, shrugs, and swaps in nail, death knell.
Which heavily borrows equity from another idiom, the final nail in the coffin. It is a perfect visual transfer. The bell is auditory, but the nail is tactile. And generally, human memory prioritizes the visual and tactile over the auditory. We remember the coffin nail much better than the church bell.
So death knell is just the brain streamlining its metaphor department. Why have two completely different metaphors for death when one handles the job perfectly well?
Efficiency at its finest.
Okay, we have to officially settle the bald-faced versus bold-faced debate I brought up at the very top. We know bald-face is the original. It links back to Shakespeare's barefaced coin around 1590 in Midsummer Night's Dream, meaning a face without a mask or beard. No deception, just open shamelessness. The lie is plain to see.
Correct. But here is the twist. Shakespeare also used bold-faced in Henry VI around the exact same time.
So they actually share a lineage. But here is why I think bold-faced is winning the war today. Bald-faced describes a state of being you are uncovered, but bold-faced describes an action or an attitude. It implies agency. You have to be incredibly confident to lie right to my face.
There's also the modern layer of typography. We live in a world of text. We all know what bold-faced type looks like. It is heavy, it is dark, it demands attention.
Right. A bold-faced lie is just a lie you can see. A bold-faced lie stands out like a newspaper headline. It feels louder. While bald-faced is technically the historical standard, bold-faced is considered just as apt today.
I completely agree. In this case, the eggcorn has evolved to fit the information age much better than the agrarian original. It's not just a mistake, it is a software update.
However, not all updates are upgrades. Sometimes the brain tries to fix a phrase and just breaks the logic completely. Let's look at some visual disconnects, starting with chalk it up.
This originates from writing bar tabs or game scores on a chalkboard. Chalk it up to experience means adding it to the tally.
But I constantly see this written out as chalk it up, C-H-O-C-K.
And this is exactly where the logic fails for me. A chalk is a wedge, like a wheel chalk for a plane. Or It comes from chock full, meaning stuffed to the point of choking.
Right. You cannot wedge a score. You cannot stuff a debt onto a board. The visual disconnect between a wedge and a tally mark is huge. It feels like the speaker knows the word chock sounds strong and decisive, but they have completely lost the narrative thread of the tally mark.
This is a clear case where the eggcorn is purely phonetic. It sounds right to the ear, but if you stop and visualize the action, it dissolves into nonsense.
Unlike our next phrase, happy as a clam, which actually gets more logical when you turn it into an eggcorn.
Well, the original phrase is truncated. People forget it used to be happy as a clam at high tide.
But that makes total sense. At high tide, the water is deep, the harvesters can't get you, you are safe. But we dropped the high tide part somewhere along the way. So now we just say happy as a clam. And honestly, why is a clam happy? It lives in mud. It's a filter feeder. Without the high tide part, the phrase makes zero sense.
It is an inscrutable creature. So the brain searches for something that actually embodies happiness.
Yeah.
And it lands on happy as a clown.
Which, depending on your childhood experiences, is either delightful or completely terrifying.
True. But culturally speaking, a clown's primary job is to project happiness. The painted smile is a much clearer signifier of joy than a bivalve shell in the mud. So happy as a clown is the brain trying to restore the logic that was lost when we cut off the tide context.
It is a logical patch. Clam implies nothing. Clown implies something, even if that something is forced, performative happiness.
Let's look at one that drives me up the wall, purely from a grammatical standpoint. Hurdle versus hurdle.
Oh, I see this in journalism all the time. The car hurtled down the highway.
And it drives me crazy. Here is the grammar lesson. Hurdle, with a D, is transitive. It means to leap over an obstacle. You must hurdle something. You hurdle a fence. You don't just hurdle.
Whereas hurdle, with a T, means to move rapidly or forcefully.
Exactly. So if a car is hurtling down the highway, it is literally jumping up and down, leaping over imaginary barriers. It is a cartoon image.
But I get why people do it. Hurdle is a very common sports term. Everyone knows what a track hurdle is. Hurdle is a bit more literary. It is another fossil-adjacent word. We rarely use hurdle outside of dramatic descriptions of train crashes or asteroids.
So the brain defaults to the more common word, physics be damned.
Moving into the final stretch of our deep dive, I noticed a distinct theme in the rest of the source material. We have a cluster of eggcorns that are all about high stakes. Survival, poverty, desperation. It seems like when the emotional stakes are high, we rewrite language to be much more gritty.
That aligns perfectly with the intensive purposes theory. We want language that matches the intensity of the human experience. Take last-ditch effort.
This has a military origin, right?
Yes, dating back to the 18th century military tradition. The last ditch was the final trench, the final line of defense before the invaders overran your position. It is a die-in-the-last-ditch scenario.
But the eggcorn is last-ditch effort, and I absolutely love this one.
Why does that one stand out to you?
Because a ditch feels somewhat static, it's just a hole in the ground, but last stitch, that implies the fabric of reality is literally tearing apart. You are down to the final thread. It evokes 11th hour determination. If only one stitch is holding your pants together, it is working incredibly hard. It feels so much more precarious.
It domesticates the danger. Most of us hasn't fought in a trench war, but we have all had a button pop off or a seam rip at a really bad moment. It translates the massive military concept into an everyday domestic crisis.
Speaking of domestic crisis, let's talk about making ends meet.
The origin here is debated. There are two main theories. One is bookkeeping matching the end of the income column to the expense column. The other is tailoring having enough cloth to make the ends of a garment actually meet.
But the eggcorn turns it into making ends meet, M-E-A-T.
This is a fascinating narrative construction. It implies that ends meet is a specific, tangible product.
The idea is that you were so poor, you are buying the butcher's scraps, the cheap cuts, the ends of the meat, just to survive.
Exactly. It changes the phrase from a sterile geometric puzzle making ends meet to a literal survival story about putting food on the table. It grounds the abstract financial struggle in physical protein.
It is much bleaker, and honestly much more powerful. We see the exact same thing with hunger pangs, P-A-N-G-S.
A pang means a sudden, sharp spasm of pain. So the original is technically correct. But pang is a literary word. Who says pang in real life?
So people make the mistake and say hunger pains.
And honestly, the word police usually let this one slide.
Yep.
A pang is a pain. The eggcorn is just removing the poetic vocabulary and replacing it with the raw sensation. It is descriptive and accurate. If you are starving, it is not a literary event. It is just pain.
We see that same simplification with bad rap.
which comes from 14th century slang. A rap meant a physical blow, which evolved into a punishment like a rap on the knuckles and eventually a prison sentence, as in a rap sheet.
But the acorn is bad rep.
Which is just the logical conclusion. Rep is short for reputation. If you have a bad rap sheet, you likely have a bad rep. The brain just skips the middleman entirely.
I want to close out our list with a pair that deals with infrastructure and physics, coming down the pike.
Pike being short for turnpike, an old word for an expressway, something moving fast towards you.
Which dates the phrase significantly. We don't really use turnpikes in our daily cultural imagination anymore, so people say, it is coming down the pipe.
The confusion here is twofold. First, pipe sounds very similar to pike. But also, the phrase in the pipeline already exists for things currently in the works. Plus, it reflects a shift in how we view delivery systems. In the past, things arrived by road. Today, essential things like data, water, and oil arrive by pipe.
It is a technological update. The metaphor has just been patched to a newer version.
And finally, we have the measurement of the microscopic, a hair's breadth.
A metaphor for a tiny width, literally the width of a human hair.
But the acorn gives us a hair's breadth, H-A-R-E, the breath of a rabbit.
This one is pure poetry to me. We escaped by a hair's breadth.
It is physically nonsensical. You cannot measure distance with breath, but it makes a feasible, poetic argument. A rabbit is skittish, fast, fragile. Its breath is silent and practically invisible, making it a feasible measurement of smallness. It suggests an escape that was so close, it was almost ghostly.
It is actually more evocative than the width of a follicle. It captures the feeling of a close call rather than the geometry of it.
And that, I think, is the ultimate defense of the acorn phenomenon.
So where does this leave us at the end of this deep dive? We have looked at 15 common gaffes. And in almost every case, maybe excepting Chalk It Up, the mistake was doing real work. It was updating history, adding emotion, or fixing a visual gap. Language is incredibly fluid.
It leaves us with the realization that the human brain is constantly trying to find logic and patterns in sound. Dictionaries are just history books. They record what we used to say. But these acorns show us what we are actually saying. The brain refuses to parrot sounds it doesn't understand. It edits reality until it makes sense.
But there is a cost to that edit. You mentioned the fossil words earlier.
Right, the trade-off is history. If we all keep using tenterhooks correctly, we preserve a tiny piece of medieval history. But if we switch to tenterhooks, we lose the history, but we gain a new, weird, highly logical image. We sever the root to the past to gain immediate modern logic.
So every time you use an acorn, you are effectively bulldozing a historic site to build a modern convenience store. It is useful, but you lost something along the way.
That is a perfect analogy.
My challenge to everyone listening this week is to pay attention. Listen closely to your friends' idioms. The next time you hear someone say deep-seated or bold-faced lie, don't be the word police who jumps in with a correction. Pause. Replay it in your head. Try to spot an acorn in the wild. Ask yourself, what logic are they seeing that the dictionary missed?
You might find that the mistake is actually the smarter version.
And as a final thought to mull over, think about where language is heading next. If our brains do this to medieval weaving terms, imagine what the artificial intelligence systems of the future will do when they process our current tech idioms. Will algorithms create digital acorns that we can't even comprehend yet? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.